I came home after my husband's funeral to tell my parents and sister he'd left me 3 apartments and a beachfront house. But before I walked in, I overheard their conversation. I froze where I stood. Page 2 was a listing agreement. Ridgeline Realty. Exclusive right to sell. 8842 South Shore Road, Pentwater, Michigan. Asking price $529,000. 60-day exclusive, 6% commission, seller to leave all appliances. Signed by the owner of record, Daniel Ostrowski. Dated March 9th. Daniel died on March 22nd. On March 9th, he could not hold a cup. I know that with the certainty of a woman who spent that entire morning turning him every 2 hours and writing down what he could and couldn't do, because that's what the chart is for. I know that at 10:15 a.m. On March 9th, I put a pen in my husband's hand so he could try to sign a birthday card for his nephew, and the pen fell out of his fingers onto the blanket, and he looked at it and he cried, and I told him it didn't matter, and he said, "It does." And that was the last full sentence I got out of him that had a verb in it. 13 days before he died, my mother had him selling a house. The courtroom was small. Probate courts always are. There's no jury box, so the room is mostly carpet and fluorescent light and a laminate rail, and it smells like the inside of a filing cabinet. Judge Marion Pell had been on the probate bench 19 years, reading glasses on a beaded chain. She read page 2 the way you read a bill you already know is wrong. Then she took the glasses off. "Mr. Sennett," she said, "is your client aware of what's in this exhibit?" Doug Sennett had been talking for 40 minutes about grief and decline and a widow who had stopped answering her phone. He had a nice suit and a laser pointer he never used. He stood up halfway and said, "Your Honor, I'd ask for a brief recess to confer." "I'd ask you to sit down," Judge Pell said. "I want to be careful here, because I've watched a lot of people describe the worst day of somebody else's life, and they always make it bigger than it was." Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up and pointed. My mother's lawyer sat down and put his hand flat on the table like he was steadying it. My mother turned her head about 4 inches toward him and did not turn it back. And that was the first crack. Not a scream. 4 inches of neck. My attorney was Ruth Kaminsky, 22 years in probate and estate litigation, a woman built like a mailbox, who wore the same gray blazer to every single meeting, and once told me, "I don't do outrage, honey. Outrage is free. Documents cost money." Ruth did the rest of it in a voice you'd use to read a weather report. Page 3 was the notary block on that listing agreement, stamped and journaled by Dolores Pankey, commission expiring in 2027, who worked the front desk at a title office on Leonard Street and who had notarized 11 documents for my mother in 14 months. Page 4 was the hospice narrative note for March 9th, written by me and co-signed by the visiting RN, describing a patient with a palliative performance scale of 30%, non-ambulatory, requiring full assist, with intermittent confusion and inability to grasp. Page 5 was the same date on my mother's phone records, subpoenaed from her carrier, showing a 14-minute call to Ridgeline Realty at 1:52 p.m. Ruth put them in that order on purpose. She told me later that judges don't get persuaded, they get cornered, and you corner them with a calendar. Judge Pell asked my mother to come forward and be sworn. I had never once in my life seen my mother look at a piece of paper and not know what it said. She's the woman who reads the back of the cereal box. She's the woman who found a $9 overcharge on a hotel bill in 2004 and got it reversed by writing 3 letters. She sat in that chair and she said, "I don't recall," 11 times. And I counted, because counting is what I do when my hands want to do something else. Then Judge Pell asked her the only question that mattered. "Mrs. Merrick, in your petition, you state that your daughter is unable to manage her property and business affairs. Prior to filing, did you manage any of her property or business affairs?" And my mother said, "Only to help." Ruth didn't even stand up. She just slid page 7 across the rail. The home equity line. $40,000 drawn in 2 tranches against the triplex on Fulton Street, a building my husband bought as a burned-out shell in 2009 and rebuilt with his own hands and rented to 3 families who still send me Christmas cards. $22,000 on March 1st, $18,000 on March 8th, deposited into a joint account my mother held with my sister. Judge Pell read it. Then she looked at my mother over the top of her glasses for what I swear was a full 5 seconds. "Help," she said. She denied the petition from the bench. She used the words "no clear and convincing evidence," and then she used some other words that I asked Ruth to pull from the transcript later, so I'd have them exactly right. The court finds the petition itself to be the strongest evidence before it, not of the respondent's incapacity, but of the petitioner's motive. She entered an order freezing any transfer, encumbrance, or listing of the properties in the estate pending further review. She referred the file to the county prosecutor's office. She directed the court's guardian ad litem to file a supplemental report within 10 days. That was the part nobody in my family had planned for. The guardian ad litem. Her name was Anne Marie Fritsch. Court-appointed, 31 years an attorney, and she'd come to my kitchen 8 days before the hearing to interview me, because in Michigan, somebody neutral has to go look at the person you're claiming can't run her own life. My mother had told me Anne-Marie was just a formality, honey. She does this all day. She'll be in and out. Anne-Marie Fritsch sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She asked me the date, the season, who the president was. She asked me to explain how a mortgage works, and I explained it. She asked what medications I took, and I told her none, which is true, and which is also the answer of a woman who has watched too many people take their first pill for sleep and their last one for everything. And then she asked, who told you to be worried about your memory? I said, my mother. She wrote that down. She wrote it down the way you write down a thing you've heard before. Her report, I read it 3 weeks later, used the phrase, the petitioner appears to have manufactured the appearance of decline through third-party inquiry. That's lawyer for. My mother called people and asked if I seemed off, and then used the fact that people were asking as proof that people were noticing. That's the part I still think about at 2 in the morning. She didn't find a symptom. She built one. She went around my life with a watering can and grew it. We walked out at 11:40 in the morning. It had been 11 days since the envelope. 24 before that since the funeral, and I had not slept more than 4 hours in a row in any of them. In the parking lot, my mother caught up with me by the ticket machine. I want to describe her face because for 38 years, I only ever saw one of them, the soft one, the casserole one, the one that says honey and sweetheart and let me just take that off your hands. The one in the parking lot was flat, bored almost, like a cashier at the end of a shift. She said, you've embarrassed this family. Not, I'm sorry, not, let me explain, not even, how could you? Embarrassed. My father was standing about 15 feet behind her, holding both of their coats. Gary Merrick, 66 years old, a man who fixed our furnace every October and never once raised his voice in my hearing. He looked at me, and then he looked at the pavement, and he kept looking at the pavement, and he carried those coats to the car like they were the only thing in the world that had ever needed him. I got in my Accord, and I drove 4 blocks and pulled into a Meijer parking lot, and I shook so hard I had to grip the wheel at 10 and 2 like a student driver, not from fear. From the adrenaline dump, which is a real physiological event, and which I have explained to 100 families in 100 hallways, and which is a completely different animal when it's happening inside your own ribs. Then I did something I'm not going to pretend was dignified. I laughed. Alone in a Meijer parking lot in my funeral-adjacent navy dress at 11:58 in the morning, I laughed until I had to wipe my face with the back of my hand, because I finally understood that she had never once, in my whole life, been on my side. Not when I was 7, not when I was 17. There had been no betrayal. Technically speaking, you can't be betrayed by somebody who was never with you. I thought that was the ending. It was maybe the first quarter. Detective Raymond Ortiz called me on a Tuesday, 8 days after the hearing. Financial Crimes Unit, 19 years, a voice like a man who's already had 4 cups of coffee and is not enjoying the 5th. He said, Mrs. Ostrowski, I've got the referral from Judge Pell's clerk. I want to be straight with you up front. These cases are hard. Families do this constantly, and almost none of it gets charged because the victim recants, or the paperwork's ambiguous, or the money moved between people who share a last name and a jury can't tell the difference between theft and a mess. I said, okay. He said, so my question is, are you going to recant? I said, no. He said, people say no in April. I said, Detective, I'm a hospice nurse. I hold people's hands while they die, and then I fill out the paperwork correctly. That's the whole job, both halves. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, all right, bring everything you have, and I mean everything, including the stuff that makes you look bad. That last part is why I trusted him. He assumed there'd be something that made me look bad. There was. I'd signed that first little piece of paper on the bed rail on a Wednesday, with my husband groaning through the wall, and no matter how many times a person tells you that's not your fault, you carry it in your chest like a swallowed key. I brought him a banker's box. Ortiz took it into an interview room with a table bolted to the floor and made us both instant coffee in paper cups, and he laid everything out in rows like he was playing solitaire. Here's what I understood by the end of that afternoon, and it changed the size of this thing entirely. Ortiz said, this isn't a plan, this is a procedure. I said, what's the difference? He said, a plan is something people make once. A procedure is something they've practiced. Then he asked me a question that had never crossed my mind. He asked whether anyone else in my family had ever had a conservator. I said no. Then I sat in that plastic chair with the coffee going cold in my hand, and I heard my own mother's voice from 2011 at a Thanksgiving table saying, Grandma's confused. She's not safe out there alone. Then I sat in that plastic chair with the coffee going cold in my hand, and I heard my own mother's voice from 2011 at a Thanksgiving table saying, Grandma's confused. She's not safe out there alone. We found her a lovely place. I said, wait. Her name was Vivian Kepler. my mother's mother. 83 years old in 2011, 90 pounds of Polish stubbornness, lived alone on 11 acres outside Fremont with a wood stove and a rotary phone and a garden she rototilled herself until the year she died. She used to send me birthday cards with a $5 bill folded inside a paper towel so you couldn't see it through the envelope. In March of 2011, my mother told the family Grandma had gotten lost driving home from church. In May, Grandma was in a facility in Newaygo County. In August, the farmhouse sold for $138,000. In February 2012, she died of pneumonia, and at the funeral, my mother stood at the front in navy. She always wears navy for the hard ones, I've since noticed. Navy is her working color, and said that the hardest thing she ever did was take the car keys from her own mother. I was 23. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I was in nursing school, and I remember thinking, that's what love looks like. Love is the person willing to be hated. Ortiz pulled the file in 4 days. It's public record. You just have to know to look. Petition for appointment of conservator, Newaygo County Probate, April 2011. Petitioner, Coral Merrick. Grounds, memory impairment following a motor vehicle incident. Supporting statements from 2 neighbors and 1 letter from a family friend. There was no motor vehicle incident. Ortiz checked. No report, no insurance claim, no citation, nothing at the sheriff's office, nothing at the state police post. My grandmother never got lost driving home from church. My mother said she did, in writing, on a form, and nobody in the entire system ever checked, because why would they? It's a daughter. Daughters worry. Conservatorship granted, unopposed, in 6 weeks. Grandma Vivian had no lawyer. Nobody appointed her one because she didn't contest it. And she didn't contest it because, and this is a detail Ortiz found in the file that I had to put down and walk away from, the notice of hearing was mailed to my mother's address as care of. The accounting my mother filed with that court in 2012 listed the farmhouse proceeds as $138,000 and listed expenditures of $119,000 for care, maintenance, and personal needs over 10 months at a facility whose private pay rate that year was $3,900 a month. Ortiz did the arithmetic on a legal pad in front of me and turned it around so I could see it. $39,000 in care, $119,000 out. I said, she practiced on her own mother. He said, she practiced on her own mother and it worked, and it took 12 years for somebody to open the file. That was the day this stopped being about $40,000. There were 4 weeks in there that I describe as the slow part, except nothing about them was slow inside my body. That's the thing nobody puts in these stories. The court moves in increments of 10 business days and your nervous system moves in increments of about 9 seconds. Beth called me on a Sunday. My sister, 35, dental hygienist, 2 kids, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms until she was 11. She opened with, I'm not calling about the money. Then she talked about the money for 19 minutes. Her position, and she'd clearly rehearsed it, was that Daniel had always intended for the cottage to be a family place, that he'd said as much at Mason's birthday party in 2021, that Mom had only been trying to keep it in the family, and that I was going to hand it to strangers because I couldn't stand to look at it, and that the kids deserved a place to swim. I said, Beth, you sat in his office. She said, I sat with him so you could sleep. I said, you took photographs. And here's what she said, and I want you to hear it exactly, because it's the sentence that told me she'd never once in her life had to hold a thought she didn't like. Everybody takes pictures of documents. That's not a crime. That's just being organized. I hung up. Then I drove 3 hours to Pentwater without deciding to. The way you find yourself in a room without remembering the hallway. There was a Ford Explorer in the driveway. Craig's, my brother-in-law's. There were 2 bicycles on the porch. There was a beach towel over the railing, a purple one with a cartoon narwhal, and a cooler, and a citronella candle burned down to the tin. Somebody had put a wind chime on the hook where Daniel's flag used to hang. They'd changed the lock on the back door, not the front, the back, the one that sticks, because the front one was newer and harder to swap out, and my brother-in-law is exactly that lazy. I stood in a driveway I paid the taxes on, and I could not get into my own house. I want to tell you, I called the sheriff and it got sorted out in an afternoon. It took 9 days and 2 trips and a certified letter, because my sister's family is staying at my vacation property, is a civil matter in Michigan, until somebody with a badge decides it isn't. A deputy named Kessler stood in that driveway with me and said, not unkindly, ma'am, I can't put a family with kids out on the road over a deed I can't verify at 10 o'clock at night. That's not corruption. That's just how it works. Systems are built for the average case, and the average case is not your mother. What finally moved it was Ruth Kaminsky faxing in this decade, a certified copy of the deed, and Judge Pell's freeze order to the sheriff's civil division at 8:15 on a Monday morning. They were out by Wednesday. They left the food in the refrigerator. Every every single thing in it. Half a watermelon, a gallon of milk, a foil pan of somebody's baked beans. I threw it all away, and then I sat down on Daniel's kitchen floor in the exact spot where he used to stand at the window with his coffee. And I did not cry, which worried me more than crying would have. My father called me twice during those weeks. The first time he talked about his truck for 6 minutes, and then said, "Your mother's not sleeping." And I said, "Neither am I." And he said, "Well," and we sat on the phone in silence for 11 seconds, and then he said he had to go. The second time he called at 10:40 at night, which he has never done in his life, and he said, "I told her in 2011 that it wasn't right." I said, "What wasn't?" He said, "The number. On the accounting. I told her the number wasn't right." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said I could go live in the farmhouse if I liked it so much." Then he said goodnight and hung up. And I understood that I'd just gotten the closest thing to a confession my father was ever going to be able to make, and that he'd been carrying it for 12 years in a garage in Wyoming, Michigan, alongside his socket wrenches. And then, on a Thursday in June at 4:15 in the afternoon, my phone rang with a 5117 area code. Lansing. "Mrs. Ostrowski, my name is Gwen Astorino. I'm an investigator with the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, Bureau of Professional Licensing. I need to inform you that a complaint has been filed against your registered nurse license." I was standing in the produce section of a grocery store holding a bag of green beans. I remember the beans. I remember the cold coming off the case. She read me the allegation in the flat cadence of a person who has to say horrible things all day and has learned not to inflect them. The complaint alleged that I had diverted controlled substances from a hospice patient, that I had administered morphine sulfate outside of prescribed parameters, that the patient, my husband, my Daniel, though the complaint never used the word husband, it used a patient in the complainant's care, had died sooner than expected, and that a family member had witnessed dosing that did not appear consistent with comfort care. Filed anonymously. Michigan allows that. Anybody can file. There's a web form. I put the beans down on top of the bagged salads and walked out of the store without my cart. Here is what a complaint like that does. And I knew all of it before she finished talking, which is the curse of knowing your own profession. It goes to an allegation review committee. If they authorize it, it becomes a formal complaint. My employer gets notified. My license doesn't get suspended on day one, usually, but my employer's risk department doesn't wait for the state. They put you on administrative leave the same afternoon because their insurance says so. And a diversion allegation involving a death gets forwarded. Not maybe. It gets forwarded to a law enforcement agency because that's the protocol. I lost my job on a Friday, not fired. Administrative leave pending resolution, which is a sentence that means you may not enter the building and you may not contact your patients, and the hospital will pay you 60% of nothing while a committee in Lansing decides who you are. I had 11 patients. 11 families who knew my voice at 3 in the morning. There was a woman named Odessa on Hall Street, 91 ALS, who would not let anybody else do her mouth care because I hummed while I did it. Somebody else did her mouth care that Monday. I wasn't allowed to call and explain why I didn't come. That is what my mother took from me, not the buildings, not the cottage. She reached into the one room in my life that was actually mine, and she turned the light off. 2 weeks later, Detective Lisa Sawinski from the Major Case Unit sat across from me at Ruth's conference table and asked me to walk her through, minute by minute, the last 72 hours of my husband's life. Ruth had told me the night before, "You're going to want to tell her you're innocent. Don't. Tell her what happened. Innocent is a conclusion. Conclusions are her job." So I sat there for 4 hours and 35 minutes and told a stranger about the last 3 days of Daniel's life. The turning schedule, the mouth swabs, the playlist. He wanted Otis Redding, and then he didn't. And then he did again. The 2 milligram doses, the exact times, his breathing at the end, which is a specific sound that I've heard maybe 600 times professionally and exactly once as a wife, and they are not the same sound. And no one tells you that. At the end, Detective Sawinski closed her notebook and said, "Who was in the house?" I said, "Me, the hospice RN on the Tuesday. My father, for about an hour, and my sister." She said, "How often was your sister there?" I said, "The last 11 days, almost every day." And Sawinski, who had said maybe 40 words in 4.5 hours, wrote something down and said quietly, more to her notebook than to me, "Then she'd know what the log looked like." I said, "What?" She said, "Mrs. Ostrowski, whoever wrote this complaint used the right words. Comfort care. Prescribed parameters, diversion." She looked up. "Civilians don't use the—" I said, "What?" She said, "Mrs. Ostrowski, whoever wrote this complaint used the right words. Comfort care, prescribed parameters, diversion." She looked up. "Civilians don't use those words. They say overdose." My hands started shaking so hard I had to put them under the table, because there were 2 people in the world who'd been in that house and knew what the log looked like. One of them was me. What saved me was the least dramatic thing in this entire story: paperwork. Hospice morphine doesn't live in a vacuum. It arrives from a specialty pharmacy pharmacy with a delivery manifest and a signature. Every bottle has a lot number and a volume. Every dose gets charted with a time, and at the end, when the patient dies, 2 people count what's left and destroy it and sign a waste form, and that form goes in a binder, and the binder is audited because the DEA has opinions about binders. Daniel's comfort kit was delivered on February 2nd by a courier named Anthony who signed at 2:14 p.m. 15 milliliters of morphine sulfate concentrate, 20 milligrams per milliliter, lot number on the label. On March 22nd at 7:50 p.m., 40 minutes after my husband stopped breathing, I sat at my own kitchen table with Dana Whitcomb, RN, my coworker, my friend, the one who'd told me my mother was making calls, and we counted 6.2 milliliters remaining, and we ran it into a jar of coffee grounds and kitty litter, and we both signed the waste form, and she wrote the time as 7:51 p.m., because Dana is exact about everything and always has been. Total administered over 49 days, 8.8 milliliters. The chart documented every one of them. The state's own pharmacy monitoring database had the fill. The courier had the delivery. The chart had the doses. Dana had the waste form. It closed. Every milliliter of it closed. Dr. Pravin Chaudhary, the deputy medical examiner who reviewed the file at Sawinski's request, wrote a 2-page memo that I have read probably 40 times. The line I keep going back to is this one. The documented dosing is at the conservative end of the range for a patient at this stage and would more accurately be characterized as undertreatment of pain than as diversion. Undertreatment. I want you to understand what that did to me because it isn't what you'd expect. I didn't feel vindicated. I sat in my car outside Ruth's office and read that sentence and thought, I let him hurt. Because I was so afraid of the exact accusation that eventually came anyway, that I gave my dying husband less than he needed. I was scared of somebody someday saying I'd rushed it. So I let him hurt, on purpose, so a chart would look clean. That's the real cost of women like my mother. She didn't just take money. She got inside my hands while I was working. The complaint got traced in 11 days. The state's licensing complaint portal, like every web form in America, logs the submitting IP address. It came from a residential Comcast account in Granville, Michigan, my sister's house. And the form asked for a callback number, which is optional and which almost nobody fills in, and which somebody had filled in, with a Google Voice number that had been created 6 days earlier and used exactly twice. Once to receive the confirmation text from the portal, and once, 3 days before that, to call a number that turned out to be the main line at Ridgeline Realty. Ortiz laughed out loud when he told me. An actual laugh. In a police station on a Wednesday. He said, they reused the burner. And then the whole thing came apart, and it came apart fast, the way a sweater does once you find the right string. Dolores Pankey went first, 58 years old. Front desk at the title company, notary commission she'd held since 1998. Ortiz didn't have to lean on her at all. She sat in an interview room and cried and said she'd been stamping documents for my mother without the signer present for over a year, because Coral was a church lady, because Coral had brought her a poinsettia at Christmas, because Coral had said, my son-in-law is too sick to come in, you know how it is. Her notary journal, the physical book, which Michigan notaries are supposed to keep and almost none of them do properly, had 11 entries. The March 9th entry listed the signer as Daniel Ostrowski and the identification as known personally to notary. She'd never met my husband, not once. She surrendered her commission and pleaded to a misdemeanor, and I've never been able to be angry at her the way I should be, because she's the only person in this entire story who, when confronted with what she'd done, said the words, I did that, without a single qualifier attached. Wendell Fisk was next. Forensic document examiner, 31 years, board certified, the kind of man who says, questioned document, instead of the fake one. He was given 9 known samples of Daniel's signature, his driver's license renewal, 2 checks, the 2019 refinance, the will itself, and the signature on the listing agreement. His report ran 14 pages. Exhibit D was a side-by-side enlargement at 400% that I could not stop looking at. Daniel's real signature had a break in it. He always lifted the pen between the D and the A, since a nail gun accident in 2013 took part of the tendon in his right index finger. Every genuine sample had that break. Every single one going back a decade. The listing agreement was one continuous stroke. Fisk's conclusion, in the standard 9-point terminology, highly probable that the questioned signature was not written by the writer of the known standards. Then Beth flipped. Ortiz didn't even have to build to it. He put the IP log and the Google Voice records on the table and asked whether she wanted to talk with a lawyer. And my sister, 35 years old, 2 kids, a woman who once cried for an hour because she hit a squirrel, asked whether she was going to jail. And when Ortiz said that depended, she started talking and did not stop for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I've read the transcript. Ruth got it in Discovery. There are 3 things in it I'll carry. The first is that the photographs on Beth's phone were taken over 4 visits, and the EXIF timestamps put the first one at 11:34 p.m. on March 12th, and I know from my own chart that at 11:30 p.m. on March 12th, I was asleep for the first time in 3 days because my sister had told me to go lie down. The second is that my mother's instruction, verbatim, was, get the account numbers, not the balances. Balances change. The third is the part where Detective Ortiz asked her why she went along with it, and Beth said, because she said if I didn't, she'd do it to me instead. And I sat in Ruth's conference room reading that line and felt something I had no room for, which was pity, not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that because people online always want the forgiveness. I don't have it. But I understood for about 4 seconds that my sister had spent her whole life on the other end of the same rope and had decided the only way off it was to help pull. The charges came down on a Tuesday in September. Against my mother, Coral Ann Merrick, 64, 2 counts of uttering and publishing a false instrument, a 14-year felony in Michigan, 1 count of forgery, 2 counts of identity theft under the Identity Theft Protection Act, 1 count of larceny by conversion over $20,000, and added in November after the Newaygo County file got a second look, 1 count of embezzlement from a vulnerable adult, my grandmother, 12 years dead, who used to hide $5 bills in paper towels. Against my sister, Elizabeth Merrick Tolliver, 1 count of attempted identity theft, 1 count of using a computer to commit a crime, and then the thing none of us saw coming. My mother had been the finance secretary at Redeemer Lutheran on Byron Center Avenue for 19 years. She counted the offering. She reconciled the accounts. She had been given that job because everybody knew Coral was careful with money. When the charges hit the paper, the Grand Rapids Press ran it, 4 paragraphs, Page 3. Wyoming woman charged in scheme against widowed daughter. The church council did what church councils do when they see their own bookkeeper's name in a headline. They called an outside audit. Thomas Beaudry CPA 6 weeks forensic engagement. $61,700 over 6 years in 17 transactions, mostly through a fictitious vendor account for facility services with a P.O. box in Byron Center. There was a family in that congregation, the Aherns, whose furnace died in February 2019, and who were told by the church that the benevolence fund was empty. It wasn't empty. It had been empty since 2017, and it had been empty because Coral Merrick emptied it, and I know their name because the pastor told me at my kitchen table with his hat in his actual hands, apologizing for something that was in no way his fault. That's when it stopped being my family's secret and became a thing people in my city talked about at gas stations. She pleaded in February. No trial. Fisk's report and the Notary Journal and her own daughter's statement made a trial suicidal, and Doug Sennett was replaced by a public defender in October because the money had gone to restitution. Sentencing was March 11th, almost exactly a year after the day she'd had a dying man sell a house. Judge Pell didn't handle it. Different court, criminal division, Judge Alvin Ruthenberg. He gave her 30 months to 14 years and ordered restitution of $119,400, which is the number that includes my grandmother. I gave a victim impact statement. 4 minutes. Ruth had helped me cut it from 11. I didn't talk about the money. I talked about March 9th, about a man who couldn't hold a pen and cried about a birthday card. I said that on the day my husband lost his signature, my mother found a use for it. I didn't look at her while I read it. I looked at Ruth. Then at the very end, I looked up, and she was sitting there with her chin lifted, mouth slightly open, the way she looks when a waiter brings the wrong side dish. Not sorry. Inconvenienced. That's the last clear picture I have of my mother's face. The Board of Nursing closed my case in December. Allegation not substantiated. No further action. 1 sentence, 1 page. I got my job back with 11 weeks of back pay after Dana and 2 other nurses and a hospice chaplain wrote letters nobody asked them to write. Odessa on Hall Street died in October. I wasn't there. Somebody else hummed, or didn't. I go back and forth about whether I get to count that as something they took from me, or whether I'm just looking for a place to put it. It's been 14 months. Beth got 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and a formal reprimand on her hygienist license that will sit in the state's public database for the rest of her working life. Craig moved out in June and moved back in August. I don't know what that means. I'm not in a position to judge a marriage. She sends me a text on the 1st of every month, always short, always some version of thinking of you. I've never answered one, and I've never deleted one either. They're all still in my phone. 13 of them. A little column of unanswered proof that she knows what she did. My father lives in the house alone. He calls on Sundays now. He talks about his truck for 6 minutes, and then we talk about actual things for 20, which is 19 more than we managed in the previous decade. Minutes, and then we talk about actual things for 20, which is 19 more than we managed in the previous decade. In April, he drove 3 hours to Pentwater to rehang the flag bracket on the porch, the one my brother-in-law had put a wind chime on, and he wouldn't let me hold the ladder. And afterward, he stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets and said, I should have said something in 2011. I said, yeah, you should have. He nodded. He didn't argue or explain or cry. He just took it, standing up in a driveway. That's the most love I've ever gotten from my father, and I'll take it. I kept the triplex. Marisol in Unit 2 had a baby in January, and I lowered her rent for 6 months, and I don't want to hear a single word about it. I sold nothing. The cottage is still 88 Wunchtine South Shore Road, and the back door still sticks. And I have not fixed it, because when it sticks, I have to put my shoulder into it. And every single time I do, I think of the last time a door didn't open for me and what was waiting on the other side. A letter came from the Huron Valley facility in July. My mother's handwriting on the envelope, which is small and even and slants right. The handwriting that filled out 19 years of offering envelopes and one listing agreement. I sat down on the porch with it. The lake was doing the flat silver thing it does at 7 in the evening. I didn't open it. I folded it in half and put it in the kitchen drawer with the rest of the paper that used to run my life. The freeze order, the exhibit list, the one-page letter from Lansing that says, not substantiated. She was right about me at the end of the day. She always was good with numbers and she was good with me. I do fold, I just don't do it for her anymore.